Well, so good to have you here tonight. As you may have heard us referring to the online audience. Yes, we have an online audience tonight. We usually don't do that on our Saturday night crew, but due to our canceled Sunday morning services, you are in a live session tonight. Make yourselves look good here, right? We're in a live session, and we just want to thank you to all who joined us, some from Greencastle, Shippensburg, our regular online viewing audience. We want to welcome you here tonight. We're in week 2 of this message series called All In. Now, I don't know what comes to your mind when you hear those words, all in, but for some of you, you're thinking that's a little bit radical, aren't you? A little bit reckless, or maybe even a little bit kind of out there. You're not quite sure if you want to go there because it's a little bit too much. This week, I read a journal called the Voice of the Martyrs, which I get every month. Read this for perspective. When I read the Voice of the Martyrs, it humbles me. It embarrasses me. It puts things in perspective because I sometimes think that maybe those little comments or those emails that I get that are against something I did is my persecution, right? I'm a persecuted pastor because not everybody likes me. I tell you what, this puts it all in perspective because I'm not persecuted at all compared to this. So I want to read something to you because I picked up this January edition, and the title of the article that caught my attention was Going Where Nobody Gets Out Alive. Does that sound like all in? I got to read this to you because this is powerful. This is about Andre and Juanita. In 2000, Andre sensed God calling him to leave his successful furniture export business and move his family to a town in one of Colombia's dangerous red zone areas controlled by violent guerrilla groups. Everyone he shared his plans with pleaded with him not to go. My parents told me, don't go. My pastor told me, don't go. They even called someone to physically block me from going. But Andre said, no, God told me that I needed to go there. Before sharing his thoughts beyond his immediate family, Andre spent several days just fasting and praying to confirm the calling. And while he was seeking assurance, his wife Juanita began to grow anxious. She said, I was fearful because we have 4 kids. I was very worried, but I trusted in the Lord. Andre told me, the Lord has sent me. When God sends, he's going to protect us. He's going to care for us. But others were more concerned for their safety. When Andre told his pastor about his decision, the pastor told him, nobody ever comes out of that town alive. And Andre's father was even more blunt. Here's half the money you'll need to buy a coffin, he said, pulling money out of his pocket and throwing it on the table. Don't leave here without buying your coffin because we know that you're not coming back. How's that for a guilt trip, right? Still, Andre was confident he was doing God's will. God is sending me, Andre told them. If it pleases him that I die there, then I will die there. Christ gave his life for me, and I have to give my life for him. Speaking about going all in, someone once said the only time that you don't want to go all in is when you're giving blood. So we have a blood drive here, right? We have people come in, right? And Charlie, and his team, they put the taps in you and you're giving blood. But listen, that is one time that we encourage people not to give 100%. Otherwise, all in, right? But you don't want to do that when you're giving blood. And yet Jesus did. All in. He bled out for us. So what's the proper response to that? Well, for Andre, he's saying, if Jesus Christ bled out for me, I'm willing to bleed out for him. I'm all in. Maybe that's what you think of when you think of all in. It's something that radical, something that reckless. Well, listen, this is not reckless. This is not irresponsible at all. This was God's call. Now, for more than 20 years, Andre and Juanita and their 4 children have been serving in that red zone in Colombia, leading many people to Jesus Christ, even some of the members of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. Was their move to Colombia reckless and irresponsible? No. It was all in, a call from God to go there. So maybe when you hear the words, though, all in, this is what you think of. I can't do that. Well, maybe when you think of the words all in, right away we think it's for somebody else, right? Oh, that's for people like Andre and Juanita. That's for those other crazy missionaries who go to these faraway places and pack up everything and take their kids and they move across, the water, across miles. That's for those people. Maybe you think it's even for a few people that just put themselves out there and become staff members at a church. It's for them. Listen, I would agree that maybe your all in is not God calling you to go a place like Colombia, but if you think all in is always for somebody else, then I would challenge you to do what Chris challenged us with early. Think about and possibly even rephrase what you say and sing to God. Instead of singing, I belong to Jesus, you ought to change the words, you belong to Jesus, right? Not me, you belong to Jesus. Instead of singing, I surrender all to him I freely give, change it to you surrender all, right? You give all to Jesus. And you know what? When you do that, make it even dramatic and point at people, right? You belong to Jesus. You surrender all, not me. When you sing that song, take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. It's going to be a little bit hard to do this lyrically, but change the words to, somebody else surrender all, right? Somebody else is consecrated, not me. So we have this idea that maybe it's for somebody else, but no, we stand up here and sing, I surrender all, I belong to Jesus, right? Take my life. Listen, I don't want you to ever lie in church, right? I don't want you to lie in church. You know what happens when you lie in church? Right? Lightning strikes or something like that. I'll never forget the story of the pastor who said, one Sunday said, next week, I'm going to be preaching a sermon online from Mark chapter 17. If you want to just read ahead, go ahead, read Mark chapter 17, prepare yourself for it. And then he left. The next Sunday he came back and he said, just for a show of hands, how many of you read Mark chapter 17? Hands went up all over the place. And he's like, awesome. Mark only has 16 chapters. Now we're going to do the sermon online, right? You don't want to lie in church. But maybe when you hear these words all in, you think this is too radical, it's reckless, it's irresponsible, so you're not going there. Maybe when you hear the words all in, you're thinking this is for somebody else. This is for people like Andre and Juanita, crazy people like this, but it is not for me. But maybe there's even, when you hear those words, there's some intrigue as to what that means. And you're wondering perhaps, what does that mean for me? What will that look like for me? That's the intent of this series. We're going to work through this series together. That's what it's all about. Last week, we introduced this series and the book that inspired it, which goes by the same title, written by Mark Batterson. Mark Batterson is a pastor at National Community Church in D.C., and in 2013, he wrote this book out of fear that many people in his church think that they were following Jesus when in fact they simply asked Jesus to follow them. And there's a difference. He calls that the inverted gospel. And it's not the gospel that brings life, or it's not the gospel that changes the world. So the intent of this series is to help us think correctly about the gospel and shaping our lives to be all in to what God intended for us to be. Now, to do this, I need to expose something to you. I think that's going to help us understand perhaps where I'm coming from with this. I often thought that I should do a message series called If I Were Satan, right? Because there's a strategy that Satan uses, and I think we need to understand what that is. So let me just try to rephrase this a little bit. If I were Satan, the first thing that I would do would be try to get all Americans to be atheists. I tried to get them to believe that there simply is no God at all. If I were Satan, I'd convince them to be atheist. The 20th century saw firsthand the consequences of the denial of God, with 100 million deaths due to atheistic communism around the world. If I were Satan, I'd try to bring that back. But if I could not convince Americans to be atheists, I would convince them to be agnostics. Just agnostics, maybe doubting whether there's a God or not. This is because the practical consequence is usually the same. Very seldom will you meet an agnostic, someone who's not sure that God is real, who acted as if he is. And to be sure, Satan is having moderate success in both of those areas in convincing people to be atheists or agnostics. In the last 10 years or the last decade, those who identify as atheists has risen from 2% in 2009 to 4% in 2019. Those who proclaim to be agnostics or call themselves agnostics has increased from 3% a decade ago to 5% today. But what about the remaining 91%? Right? Those who still have some form of faith or persist that there's some form of faith. Well, listen, if I were Satan and if I could not convince Americans to abandon their faith entirely, I would come up with the third strategy. I can't convince them all to be atheists. I can't convince them all to be agnostics. So the third strategy that I have was I would keep people from going all in. That's it. I would just keep people from going all in. I'd let them live half-hearted Christian lives. I'd want them to think that maybe they're following me, but maybe they're not fully. I would get them to think that they're okay just by not doing bad things rather than going all in for me. I would get people to start living in their past. I'd have them start thinking perhaps about past bitterness and regret and failures and shame and guilt and fear, because all of those things will keep you from going all in. I'd get people to stop living by imagination, and I'd have them start living by memory. Memories that produce all those horrible things from the past. You ready for a little history lesson? On February 19th, it was 1519, the Spanish explorer Hernan Cortez set out for Mexico with an entourage of 11 ships, 13 horses, 110 sailors, and 553 soldiers. The indigenous population upon his arrival was approximately 5 million. So from a purely mathematical standpoint, the odds were stacked against him by 7,541 to 1. No possibility of victory there. 2 previous expeditions, by the way, had failed to even establish a settlement in the New World, and yet Cortez is known to have conquered almost the whole South American continent. What Cortez is reported to have done after launching is an epic tale of mythic proportions. He issued an order that turned his mission into an all-or-nothing proposition, and his order was, as soon as they arrived, his order was, burn the ships. Burn the ships. As his crew stood there and watched all 11 ships burn and sink, they came to terms with the fact that retreat was not an option. The ships that got them there were no longer available to take them back, and if you can compartmentalize the moral conundrum of colonization, there's a lesson to be learned in that. There's no plan B. We're just living plan A. There are moments in our lives, church, when we need to burn the ships to our past. And we do so by making a defining decision that will eliminate the possibility of going back. We don't keep a plan B. No, when you come to Christ and you go all in, you burn the ships, you burn the past, you don't go back. You're going forward, plan A with Jesus Christ. You burn the ships named past failure. You might even have to burn some ships named past success. You burn the ship named bad habit, named regret, named guilt, named shame, bitterness. You burn the ship named my old way of life. There is no turning back. When you're all in, you're all in. Let me tell you about a guy by the name of Elisha. Love this story. Great guy. Elisha's story is found in 1 Kings chapter 19. Elisha was born and raised in a region of Israel known as Abel Mahala. Abel Mahala. The English translation of that word simply means meadow of dancing. Sounds like a great place to live, doesn't it? Meadow of dancing. It was the breadbasket of the Jordan River Valley. Elisha's family ran this very productive and profitable farming operations. Many farms at that time would only have one pair of oxen. And that's what they would use. They would yoke them together, 2 oxen, 1 pair. They would yoke them together to do all the plowing and all the field work. But this guy, Elisha's family, had 12 pairs of oxen. which means that there was some kind of a small enterprise at work there, along with farmhands to plow them. What this tells us is that Elisha came from a very, very wealthy family. He's part of a very successful family business. And it was all his to inherit. And yet he does something so curious that I want to zero in on in these next few moments. But before I tell you what he did, let me introduce you to another guy that's a major part of his story. The other part of this story includes a guy by the name of Elijah. So now we have Elijah and we have Elisha. Elijah was a prophet, and his story kind of gets lost in 1st and 2nd Kings. He doesn't get his own book like Isaiah and Jeremiah did. No, his story gets lost in some of the other books of the Bible, but he's a prophet of God, and God had a plan for Elisha to be Elijah's successor. So Elijah was the older guy, Elisha was the younger guy, and God had called out Elisha to be this prophet. He just didn't know it yet, right? But he was going to call him sometime to go all in through Elijah. Let me tell you the story, or read the story from 1 Kings chapter 19, beginning in verse 19. As Elijah's ministry came to a close right now, it was soon time to transfer, right, this prophet to the next generation, to the next guy. And here's what it says in verse 19. So Elijah went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah, but he said, hey, let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will come back with you. Okay, go back, Elijah said, what have I done to you? So Elisha left and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and give it to the people, and they ate. And then he set out to follow Elijah, and he became his servant. Let me explain to you what just happened. Elijah comes along, and he does this Antonio Brown thing. Well, not really. But he took off his jersey, he took off his outer cloak, right? And he put it on Elisha. That was a symbolic transference or a gesture of succession. The prophet Elijah was now transferring his role over to Elisha and his authority. And Elisha recognized that as God's call for him to go all in. And so he barbecues the oxen, right? He burns his plowing equipment. This, by the way, was more than him just quitting his job. It was actually divesting himself of his share of the family business. It might even have been writing himself out of the family will, for all I know. Sometimes we tend to hedge our bets, but not Elisha. No, he has no plan B. If this prophet thing doesn't work out, he has no plan B. He just burned the plows. He just barbecued the oxen. He just got rid of everything from his past. Kind of strikes me as someone that's going all in, isn't it? Well, the story continues in 2 Kings chapter 2, where the transfer now is coming to a completion. And Elijah says to Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 10, tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you? And Elisha says, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. Oh, Elijah says, you have asked a difficult thing, and yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Now, let me just make a long story short. It happened. It was. He received a double blessing. Now, here's the cool thing. During Elisha's 60 years of prophetic ministry, Elisha performed 28 miracles as recorded in Scripture. Do you know how many Elijah performed? 14. Elisha performed exactly twice as many miracles as Elijah did. He received that double portion. Now, the reason this is significant is this. Elisha could have lived his entire life in Dancing Meadows. It was a great place. He could have lived his entire life there. He could have had a very comfortable life. He could have played it very safe there instead of stepping out in faith. He could have protected his reputation instead of risking it. He could have saved his money instead of giving it. He could have plowed his fields. He could have kept his profitable business instead of following the call that God placed on his life. But if he had done all that, he would have forfeited what? 28 miracles. 28 miracles that God did with his life because he was willing to leave the past and go all into what God had called him to. Listen, that's what's on the table this weekend here at Grand Point. That's exactly what this message is all about. If you are not willing to go all in with God, perhaps you're forfeiting the miracles that he has planned for your lives. If it's okay with you, I'm just going to go all in for the next few moments and just share a few practical scenarios that might be a bit uncomfortable for some of us, but I love you too much not to share it. Penny and I had I don't know what kind of conversation to call it. It was a hard conversation today, but this kind of wrecked me because I felt that maybe God was speaking something to me in this as well. But when I was working through this week, here's what God laid on my heart. I got to share this with you. But for you to be willing to go all in, number one, you must be willing to stop. Stop. Sometimes in ministry, pastors or counselors, they have all these people come to them with their problems and these things. And one of the jokes is our response to them is just stop it. Just stop it, right? I don't want to be that simplistic tonight because I know that stopping some things is just not that easy. It takes a lot of times. It takes steps in that direction. But number one, you need to be willing to stop. Stop regretting the past and learn from it. Stop holding grudges and offer forgiveness. You've got one life to live. Do you know that? You've got one life to live. Why would you live it? Why would you live it with unforgiveness? Why would you choose to live it in a place where you're not receiving the miracles of God in your life, where you're not understanding the joy of forgiveness, where you're not living in freedom? You've got one life. Stop living with guilt and lean into God's grace. Stop beating yourself up and let the Spirit of God heal your heart. Stop believing that you are not good enough for God to use you. If there is anyone in the room that has that problem, come and talk to me, because we have something in common. Stop believing the lies of the enemy and let your best friend do a miracle in your life. Listen, you can't divorce yourself from the past. In one sense, you're married to it forever. But God wants to reconcile your past by redeeming it. God is in the recycling business. He makes recycled goods out of wasted lives. But you've got to stop holding on to the past. Is that too simplistic? Does that make sense at all? Listen, if you want to go all in, you've got to stop dwelling on the past, because God has a future plan for you, perhaps with 28 miracles to your name. I don't know, maybe it's even more than that. But God has a blessing for you in the future. Are you willing to step out and claim it? Number two, you must be willing to serve. Let me go back to the text of 1 Kings where Elisha barbecued and burned his stuff. Remember? After he did that, I don't want you to miss this. But it says, then he set out to follow Elijah and become his, say it with me, servant. Become his servant. Become his intern. Become his apprentice. This whole story seems so glamorous, but what really is happening is a demotion. Elisha is going from CEO of Elisha Farms, Inc., right, to an unpaid internship with an itinerant prophet named Elijah, who, by the way, is suffering from severe depression. Tell me that's not going to be a great working relationship, right? But that's what God called him to. In one day, Elisha goes from the very top of the totem pole to the very bottom. He went from calling the shots to making coffee and making copies, right? As an intern, he got jobs no one wanted to do. You need to listen to this, though. If you do the job that no one wants, you'll eventually get the job that everybody wants. Listen, that's a principle that will work. If you do the job, if you're willing to do the job that nobody wants, You'll most likely be promoted someday to the job that everybody wants. You have to be willing to climb the ladder starting at the very bottom rung. Every black belt was once a white belt, right? Every concert pianist started out with scales. Every PhD went to kindergarten. You have to be willing to leave the seat of honor and take the lowest place at the table. After all, isn't that what Jesus did for us? He who being in the very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. He became a servant of all by putting a towel around his waist and washing his feet. If you think you're too good to serve at the lowest level, you're not able to go all in. You'll never go all in with God. You must be willing to stop. Dwelling on your past, you must be willing to serve. Number 3, you must be willing to sacrifice. Sacrifice by its very nature costs you something. It's not just giving your leftovers. It's not about your surplus. It's not about convenience. It's usually something that hurts. Last fall, my son Dustin and I spoke at the father and son retreat out at Camp Joel. We spoke about Abraham and Isaac. And we called that a father-son retreat, right? But that would be the father-son retreat of the worst kind, because you know what God asked Abraham to do? He said, I want you to sacrifice your son, Isaac, your only son, Isaac. That doesn't make any sense at all, does it? That is one of the hardest passages in the Bible for me to believe that God would do or ask of someone. It's the hardest place for me to believe. And so my son and I shared that together. But the beautiful thing is, Abraham was willing to do that, and he saw, again, a miracle of God in his life that he would have missed had he not been willing to sacrifice. Same thing is true for you. If you're willing to sacrifice, if you're willing to give till it hurts, if you're willing to do something that is totally out of your comfort zone, you are about to receive and see a miracle of God happen in your life. Let me just close tonight by being very clear. This is not a message about quitting your job. It's not even about changing jobs. Certainly not about changing spouses. It's not even about changing circumstances. It's about changing you. It's about changing you. Let me ask the question tonight, what needs to happen in you to be ready for what our miracle-working God wants to do in you? What needs to happen? What do you need to let go of? What do you need to commit to? What do you need to fall down on your face before God and confess and do? Because I believe that everyone in this room has been called. You may not be called to go to some place where your life is being threatened, where you're living every day in fear that someone might take you out today. That might not be your calling. But I believe God is calling all of us to go all in. If you're a disciple of Jesus Christ, he said at one point, come, follow me. Come, follow me. Are you willing to do whatever that takes? Are you willing to go wherever he calls? Are you kind of happy in Dancing Meadows? Just living your life there. It's comfortable. It's a place where you know everybody. It's kind of a place where you know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know where you are with this, but I want to just kind of pray for us tonight, because I'm praying for myself on this one as well. But I don't know what decision you need to make. I just want you to know that you're one decision away from a totally different life. And that one decision might be the toughest. It might be the most painful decision that you will ever make. But if you have the courage to make it, can change your life forever. God, I thank you so much for this challenge to go all in. As Chris said at the very beginning of the worship set, this series might be one that just kind of wrecks us, kind of makes us think, and raises a lot of questions in our minds, at least it does in mine. Am I all in? Am I willing to go all in? Am I willing to do whatever that means? And Father, I just pray tonight that as your people gathered here and gathered online this weekend, that we would be willing to surrender all that we are to all that you want to do in us and through us. God, I know that sounds easy in one sense to say I'm all in with you, but it's so hard to do. But we want to give you all of our devotion. We want to give you all of our life. We want to just honor everything that you did for us. And we want to go all in and discover that you're enough for us. You're enough. All our lives, all our devotion, we give to you. In your name I pray. Amen.